Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Mulhausen Poltergeist. It is a story that begins not with a scream or a crash, but with the simplest, most domestic of sounds. We are traveling back in time to the late summer of 1979. Imagine the air of August, heavy and gold, hanging over the small German village of Mulhausen. This is a place where the Rhine Valley stretches out in a patchwork of emerald fields and ancient forests, where the pace of life follows the slow, rhythmic turning of the seasons. In 1979, the world felt smaller, more contained. There were no glowing screens to distract us, only the rustle of the evening breeze through the poplars and the distant chime of the church bell marking the passage of the hours. Let yourself settle into this quiet world. Breathe in the scent of dry hay and cooling pavement as the sun begins its long, slow descent below the horizon. The village of Mulhausen was, by all accounts, an unremarkable sanctuary of peace. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew the sound of each other's garden gates, and where the arrival of a new car was the height of local gossip. Among the tidy rows of homes stood the residents of the Schuler family. Bernhard and his wife lived a life of quiet dedication, opening their home to foster children, providing a stable and loving environment in a house that felt solid, modern, and safe. The house itself was a product of the mid-20th century, built with sturdy walls and large, clear windows that looked out onto a manicured garden. There was nothing about the architecture that suggested the macabre. No dark basements with hidden secrets, no crumbling attics. It was a home of light and order. But as the heat of 1979 reached its peak in late August, that order began to fray at the edges, beginning with a sound so subtle it was almost missed. It was the evening of August 24th. The twilight was lingering, a deep violet bruise spreading across the sky. Inside the Schuler home, the day was winding down. The children were preparing for sleep, and the adults were savoring the first cool draft of air coming through the cracked windows. Then it happened. A single sharp tap against the glass. Talk. It was followed by two more in rapid succession. Talk. Talk. It was a sound with a distinct physical presence, like the hard knuckle of a hand striking the pane from the outside. Bernhard looked up, his brow furrowing. It was too rhythmic to be a stray branch or a bird lost in the dark. He waited, his ears straining against the silence of the house. For a long minute, there was only the ticking of the clock in the hallway, a steady, mechanical heartbeat that suddenly felt much louder than it had moments before. Just as he began to relax, the sound returned. This time, it wasn't on the glass. It seemed to come from the very wood of the window frame, a series of 3 knocks, deliberate and measured. 1, 2, 3. It had an intelligent quality, a cadence that suggested someone was standing just inches away, on the other side of the thin barrier, waiting for a response. Bernhard rose from his chair, his movements slow and careful. He stepped toward the window, pulling back the heavy curtain. Outside, the garden was a sea of shadows. The silver moonlight caught the leaves of the shrubs, but there was no one there. No retreating figure, no rustle of footsteps on the gravel path. The air outside was perfectly still, the heat of the day having left the earth breathless. He stepped out onto the terrace, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the property, but the night was empty. It was just him, the moonlight, and the deepening sense of unease cooling the back of his neck. When he returned inside, the house felt different. The familiar walls seemed thinner, less capable of keeping the world out. He explained it away as a prank, perhaps the neighborhood children playing a game in the dark. Yet deep down, a small seed of doubt had been planted. The sound had been too heavy, too precise. As the family retired to their beds that night, the tapping followed them. It migrated from the living room to the upper floor, manifesting on the walls of the children's bedrooms. It was a dry, hollow sound, like someone rapping on a casket. It wasn't loud enough to wake the neighbors, But in the silence of the 1979 night, it was deafening. Each tap seemed to resonate through the floorboards, vibrating in the soles of their feet. It was a rhythm that demanded attention, a clandestine language that they could not yet translate. They lay in the dark, eyes wide, listening to the house speak in a voice that should not have existed. As the hours moved toward the dawn of August 25th, the family realized that the tapping was not random. It seemed to respond to their movements. When they moved to a different room, the sound followed, trailing them through the plaster and lath like an invisible shadow. If they spoke, the tapping would cease, as if the entity were listening. When they fell silent, it would begin again, a patient, persistent reminder of its presence. This was the birth of the Mulhausen Poltergeist, or the knocking ghost. In those early, hushed hours, the Schulers could not have known that their quiet home in the Rhine Valley was about to become the epicenter of a parapsychological storm. They were simply a family trying to understand why the walls were answering back. For now, the sounds were just taps, small and curious. But the shadow was growing longer, and the first tap was merely the opening note of a symphony that would soon involve scientists, police, and the world's most famous ghost hunters. Rest now, for the night is still young, and the rhythm of the glass is just beginning to tell its story. While the family stood paralyzed by the realization that the tapping responded to their every step, the house itself seemed to offer a mocking silence. To understand how such an ordinary space could become a vessel for the inexplicable, one must look back at the home as it was, a sanctuary of order. The house on the outskirts of Mulhausen sat at the end of a long, dusty road, marking the boundary between the cobblestone streets and the emerald fields of the Thuringian countryside. In 1923, this was a place of deep, resonant quiet. The air was thick with the scent of pine and the sweet smell of turned soil. It was a modest structure, yet it carried an air of respectability reflecting the status of the man who lived there, a schoolteacher who valued logic and the steady rhythm of a well-ordered life. As you approached the property, the first thing you would notice was the garden. It was not a wild patch of land, but a meticulously tended space where vegetables and flowers grew in obedient lines. Low stone walls hummed with the warmth of the afternoon sun, providing a resting place for cats and a boundary for the family world. The teacher's wife spent her mornings here, her hands moving through the soil with practiced grace, unaware that the ground beneath her would soon feel alien. The house itself was a sturdy example of local craftsmanship, with heavy timber frames and thick, whitewashed walls designed to keep the world at bay. It was a home built for longevity, for the raising of children and the passage of decades, standing as a silent witness to the beauty of a provincial life. Stepping across the threshold, the transition from the bright exterior to the shaded interior was always accompanied by a particular set of sensations. There was the faint aroma of beeswax on the dark wood banisters and the sharp scent of lye from the kitchen. The floorboards, cut from old-growth oak, gave a soft, predictable groan underfoot, a sound that in any other year was a comforting sign of a family in motion. In the kitchen, the heartbeat of the home, a heavy iron stove stood as a monument to domesticity. Copper pots hung from the ceiling, catching the low evening light and casting amber reflections across white-tiled walls. It was a room of heat and nourishment, where the clink of silverware and low murmurs formed the soundtrack of their evenings, a rhythm that had remained unchanged for many years. The teacher's study was the most sacred space in the house. It was a room lined with books that smelled of old parchment and leather, a collection spanning classical philosophy and the scientific theories of the early 20th century. A heavy mahogany desk sat near the window, positioned so the teacher could look over the fields while he graded papers. This was a room of reason, where every object had a place and every thought was subjected to the rigors of proof. To the teacher, the world was a machine that could be understood through observation. He believed in the solidity of the walls and the permanence of the ceiling. The idea that his sanctuary could become a stage for the impossible was not just frightening. It was an affront to everything he had spent his life teaching his students. Upstairs, the bedrooms were simple and spare, reflecting the modest means of a rural educator. The windows were small, framing slices of the night sky that seemed to watch over the family as they slept. In the daughter's room, the air was often cooler, a slight draft tracing through the frame and stirring the thin curtains. Her room was a private world of girlhood dreams and schoolbooks, tucked away at the end of the hallway where the shadows gathered a little more thickly than elsewhere. It was here that the first stirrings of the unrest were felt, though at the time they were dismissed as the settling of timbers or the wind. The peace of the house was a fragile thing, held together by the collective belief that they were safe and that their walls were thick enough to keep mysteries out. By the time the sun set on the final evening of true normalcy, the house was a picture of tranquility. The children had finished their chores, the teacher had closed his books, and the lamps were lit. There was no indication that the boundary between the physical and the spectral was thinning. The history of the land was unremarkable, with no tales of ancient tragedies to warn them. They were simply a family living on the edge of a quiet town, participating in the timeless rituals of home. Yet, as the clock in the hallway struck the hour, the silence began to feel heavy, as if the house itself were holding its breath, waiting for the first tap to echo through the hallway and change their lives forever. The tea had been cleared away, the table wiped clean with a damp cloth, and the heavy iron stove was cooling down, its metal skin expanding and contracting with soft, rhythmic ticks. In 1922, the kitchens of Mulhausen were spaces of hard-won order, where every ceramic bowl and every pewter spoon had a dedicated place on the wooden dresser. As the family retreated into the living area, leaving the kitchen to the deepening shadows of the evening, the air seemed to thicken. It was no longer just the scent of coal dust and scrubbed pine that filled the room, but a peculiar, heavy stillness. The transition from the ordinary to the impossible did not happen with a scream or a crash. It began with a sound so delicate that it was almost lost to the wind outside. It was a rattle, tiny and persistent, coming from the corner where the drinking water was kept in a large stoneware pitcher. At first, the parents assumed it was a loose floorboard or perhaps a stray rodent seeking warmth beneath the cabinets. They stood in the doorway, their lanterns casting long, flickering shadows against the plaster walls, waiting for the sound to repeat. Then they saw it. A single silver spoon, resting inside a heavy ceramic mug, began to vibrate. It did not just shake, it danced against the inner rim of the cup, creating a rapid, metallic chatter that echoed through the silent house. There was no draft in the room, and the table beneath it was solid oak, unmoving and firm. The rattle was hypnotic, a repetitive clinking of metal against stone that seemed to possess its own frantic heartbeat. They watched, breathless, as the spoon suddenly stood upright for a fraction of a second, as if held by an invisible hand, before falling back against the porcelain with a final, hollow ring. The family moved closer, their footsteps light on the floor, yet their presence only seemed to feed the agitation in the room. On the open shelving of the dresser, the stacks of dinner plates began to shift. These were heavy pieces, thick-rimmed and sturdy, yet they moved as if they had become weightless. One plate at the top of a stack of 6 began to rotate slowly, clockwise, then counterclockwise, the sound of ceramic grinding against ceramic filling the kitchen with a dry, unsettling screech. The father reached out a hand to steady the pile, but as his fingers drew near, the movement ceased instantly. The kitchen returned to its frozen state, the only sound being the heavy breathing of the watchers. They searched for a logical explanation, checking the level of the shelves and the stability of the legs, but the furniture was as steady as the foundation of the house itself. As the night wore on, the subtlety of the rattle evolved into something far more deliberate. In the cutlery drawer, which remained shut tight, The sound of 100 knives and forks clashing together erupted with sudden violence. It sounded as if someone were reaching inside and stirring the metal with a furious intensity. When the father pulled the drawer open, the implements were found in a chaotic heap, tangled in ways that seemed physically impossible for a simple vibration to achieve. Prongs of forks were interlaced with the handles of spoons, and a heavy carving knife was found standing blade down, wedged perfectly into the wooden grain of the drawer's base. The family began to feel a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. They realized that the house was no longer merely a shelter. It had become a stage for a force that knew their routines and was now choosing to disrupt them. The teenage daughter, who had remained quiet in the shadows, finally stepped into the center of the kitchen. As she moved, the activity intensified. A small salt cellar on the table began to slide across the smooth surface, moving inches at a time in short, jerky bursts. It tracked a path toward the edge, defying the slight incline of the wood that should have sent it in the opposite direction. Every few seconds, it would stop, as if waiting for the girl to look directly at it, before resuming its slow, impossible trek. The family watched in a trance-like state, their minds struggling to process the sight of a domestic object moving with a life of its own. There was no wind, no magnetism, and no hidden strings. There was only the cold, hard reality of the salt cellar inching closer to the precipice of the table, guided by a will they could not see. Just before the salt cellar reached the edge, it came to a complete halt. For a long minute, the kitchen was silent again. Then, from the very back of the highest shelf, a small ceramic teacup, one that had not been used in years, was nudged forward. It didn't fall. It seemed to float for a terrifying second, suspended in the air just beyond the shelf's lip, before it plummeted. It shattered on the floor, the sound of breaking china like a gunshot in the confined space. The white shards scattered across the floorboards, gleaming in the lantern light. This was the end of the simple rattles and the quiet shifts. The energy in the house had found its strength, moving from the movement of small objects to the destruction of them. As the family stood amidst the broken porcelain, they knew that the peace they had enjoyed just hours ago was a memory that would not return for a very long time. The kitchen was held in a frozen, breathless state. The salt cellar, having moved with such deliberate intent, now sat motionless at the edge of the wooden table, a silent witness to the impossibility of the last few minutes. The family remained huddled together, their eyes fixed on the back of the room where the shadows seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air felt charged, heavy with the metallic tang of an approaching storm, yet the night outside was perfectly still. It was in this heavy, oppressive quiet that the next phase of the haunting began. It did not start with a scream or a crash, but with a sound so delicate it was almost rhythmic. A faint, hollow click echoed against the floorboards, followed by a soft thud that seemed to vibrate through the very soles of their feet. The father, holding a flickering candle that cast long, trembling shadows against the plaster walls, lowered the light toward the floor. There, resting in the center of the room, was a small gray stone. It was a common pebble, perhaps 2 inches in diameter, the kind one might find at the bottom of a shallow creek bed. But there were no creeks inside this house, and the doors and windows had been barred shut since sunset. As they watched, another sound drew their gaze upward. Near the ceiling, where the heavy oak beams met the whitewashed plaster, the air itself seemed to ripple, like heat rising off a summer road. A second stone appeared, not falling with the acceleration of gravity, but drifting downward as if it were submerged in invisible water. This was the most baffling detail of the Mulhausen case. In the year 1888, witnesses would later testify under oath that these objects did not behave according to the laws of nature. The stone moved with a dreamlike slowness, turning over and over in the air as it descended. It took several seconds for it to travel the 7 feet from the ceiling to the floor. The family stood paralyzed, watching the gray mineral shape trace a path through the dim light. There was no hole in the roof, no gap in the floorboards above, and no person hidden in the rafters. The stone had simply materialized in the empty space of the room, emerging from the void to make its presence known in the physical world. One of the children reached out a hand, a gesture of pure, terrified curiosity. As a third stone began its slow, spiraling descent, the young boy caught it midair. He immediately let out a sharp cry and dropped it. It was not heavy, but it was intensely, unnaturally warm. When the father knelt to retrieve it, he found the stone felt as though it had been sitting under a blistering noon sun for hours, despite the fact that the house was chilled by the damp evening air of October. He turned the pebble over in his palm, noting its smooth, water-worn surface. It was a piece of the earth, tangible and solid, yet its arrival was entirely ghostly. The heat radiating from the stone was a physical manifestation of the energy required to pull it from wherever it had originated. Suddenly, the tempo changed. The slow, individual drops gave way to a steady, silent rain of minerals. Dozens of stones, ranging from the size of a marble to the size of a man's fist, began to manifest across the kitchen and the adjacent hallway. They did not strike the furniture with force. They landed with soft, muffled thumps as if the house itself were catching them. The sound was like a heartbeat, slow and persistent. Click, thud, click, thud. The family retreated toward the corner of the room, shielding their heads, but the stones seemed to avoid them. They fell around the people, never on them, creating a growing perimeter of gray and brown rocks that hemmed the family into a smaller and smaller space. The floor was becoming a mosaic of inexplicable evidence. The father took his heavy iron shovel and began to push the stones into a pile, desperate to clear a path. As he worked, he noticed that as soon as he moved a stone, another would manifest in the exact spot he had just cleared. It was a repetitive, mocking cycle. The sheer volume was staggering. By the time the clock struck midnight, they had collected hundreds of pebbles. Each one was examined, and each one bore the same characteristics. Smooth, warm, and entirely ordinary in appearance, yet impossible in origin. The terror of the night was no longer just about what they couldn't see. It was about the mounting weight of what they could. They were being buried in the evidence of a haunting, one stone at a time. In the flickering candlelight, the pile of stones looked like a cairn, a monument to a presence they could not understand. The mother began to pray, her voice a low murmur that competed with the steady clicking of the falling rocks. She noticed that when her voice grew louder, the stones seemed to fall faster, as if the sound waves were agitating the very fabric of the room. The children sat on the floor, their eyes wide and glassy, watching the ceiling with a fixed intensity. They were no longer looking for ghosts in the shadows. They were looking for the moment of creation, the split second where the nothingness became something. They watched for that brief, silver shimmer that preceded each new stone's arrival. The atmosphere in the house had shifted from a domestic setting to something resembling a laboratory of the occult. The familiar smells of dried herbs and wood smoke were replaced by the dry, dusty scent of pulverized rock and ozone. Every surface was covered in a fine layer of grit. As the hours stretched toward the dawn, the rain of stones did not cease, but the stones themselves began to change. They were no longer just pebbles. Some were jagged fragments of flint, others were shards of red brick that looked as though they had been ripped from a building miles away. The entity in Mulhausen was no longer just making things appear. It was beginning to bring pieces of the outside world into the sanctuary of the home, breaking the boundaries of stone and spirit. The transition from a quiet family grievance to a matter of public order occurred under the heavy, iron-gray skies of a late autumn evening in 1848. Outside the stone walls of the house in Mulhausen, the world was preoccupied with the tremors of political revolution. Yet inside, a much more intimate and terrifying upheaval was taking place. The local authorities, initially dismissive of the family's frantic reports, finally arrived in the form of a high-ranking inspector and two of his most stoic constables. They did not come to investigate the supernatural. They came to catch a common vandal, perhaps a neighbor with a grudge or a local youth with a clever slingshot and a thirst for mischief. To the inspector, a man whose life was built upon the rigid pillars of logic and the tangible weight of evidence, there was no problem that could not be solved with a firm hand and a pair of iron shackles. As the inspector crossed the threshold, his heavy leather boots echoed against the floorboards with a rhythmic, authoritative thud. He was a man of significant stature, wrapped in a coat of thick, dark wool that smelled of tobacco and the damp evening air. His eyes, sharp and inquisitive, immediately began to scan the entryway, looking for the telltale signs of human entry. He paid little mind to the domestic details, the slightly askew portraits, or the way the family huddled together in the corner of the parlor. To him, the house was merely a crime scene waiting for a rational explanation. He moved with a practiced, cynical grace, his presence acting as a cold front that momentarily pushed back the thick, stifling atmosphere of the home. The previous sense of dried herbs and ancient dust seemed to retreat before his pungent aroma of industrial city life and official business. The officers began their work by conducting an exhaustive search of the perimeter. They circled the garden with lanterns held high, the yellow light catching the frost on the dying hydrangeas and the gnarled roots of the apple trees. They climbed ladders to inspect the slate roof, searching for loose tiles or hidden mechanisms that might explain the stones that had been plaguing the inhabitants. They checked the chimneys for soot-stained wires and peered into the dark recesses of the cellar, where the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and rotting apples. Every window was inspected for cracks, every door for faulty latches. The inspector took notes in a small, leather-bound book, his pen scratching across the paper with a dry, abrasive sound. He was convinced that by the end of the night, he would find the person responsible for this elaborate hoax and restore order to this corner of Mulhausen. Eventually, the search led them back into the heart of the home, specifically to the room that had become a makeshift laboratory of the occult. It was a space filled with the strange artifacts of the family's growing obsession. Bundles of sage hanging from the rafters, bowls of salt placed at the corners of the rug, and a collection of old, leather-bound volumes resting on a heavy oak table. The inspector scoffed as he brushed past a bunch of dried wormwood, his shoulder catching the brittle stems and sending a fine dust into the air. He stood in the center of the room, his hands clasped behind his back, and declared that he and his men would remain there until morning. If a vandal intended to strike, they would have to do so under the watchful gaze of the law. He ordered the lamps to be trimmed, and for a long time, the only sound was the slow, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. The silence was absolute, a heavy velvet weight that seemed to press against the inspector's eardrums. Then, without any warning, the peace was shattered by a sharp, resonant crack. A small, smooth stone, no larger than a walnut, suddenly skittered across the polished surface of the oak table. It had not come from the window, which remained shut and locked. It had not come from the doorway, where a constable stood guard. It seemed to have materialized in the very air of the room. The inspector froze, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the object. He did not move at first, perhaps waiting for his brain to catch up with his eyes. He slowly reached out and picked up the stone. To his immense shock, the surface of the rock was unnaturally warm, as if it had been sitting in the palm of a living hand for hours. He turned it over, looking for some mark or clue, but it was nothing more than a common river stone, smoothed by centuries of water. Before he could utter a word of command, a second stone struck the floor near his feet, and then a third bounced off the high ceiling. The sound was rhythmic and deliberate, like an invisible drummer playing a slow, erratic cadence. The constables rushed into the room, their faces pale in the flickering light of the oil lamps. They checked the ceiling for holes, but the plaster was smooth and unbroken. They checked the floorboards, but they were solid. The inspector stood amidst the growing chaos, his authoritative mask beginning to crumble. He watched as a heavy brass candlestick on the mantel began to vibrate, its base humming against the wood until it slowly tipped over and fell to the hearth. There was no wind. There were no wires. There was only the impossible, unfolding in the presence of the very men sworn to uphold the physical laws of the world. By the time the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly light through the curtains, the inspector's notebook remained open, but its pages were blank. He found himself unable to translate the night's events into the clinical language of a police report. How could he describe the way a stone could fall from a solid ceiling? How could he explain the heat that radiated from a cold piece of granite? He gathered his things with trembling hands, his movements hurried and stripped of their earlier confidence. He did not look at the family as he left, nor did he offer any words of reassurance. He simply walked out into the crisp morning air of 1848, leaving the house behind. The law had arrived looking for vandals, but it had found something that required a different kind of justice, a force that did not recognize badges or follow the decrees of men. The inspector was gone, but the shadows remained, deeper and more defiant than before. The morning air in the house at Mulhausen was thin and smelled of cold iron and unwashed stone. The inspector sat at the small kitchen table, his eyes tracing the grain of the wood as the first traces of dawn began to touch the window panes. By the time the sun began to bleed a pale, sickly light through the curtains, the inspector's notebook remained open, but its pages were blank. He found himself staring at the empty white space, his quill dry and his mind heavy with the weight of the previous night. There was a peculiar, suffocating stillness that follows a period of high tension, a silence that feels less like peace and more like a predator holding its breath. He had come to this village expecting the simple mechanics of a prank or the clumsy efforts of a disgruntled neighbor, but the lack of evidence was becoming a form of evidence in itself. His fingers brushed against the paper, the texture of the vellum a reminder of the physical world he so desperately wanted to rely upon. But as the shadows retreated into the corners of the room, that physical world began to fracture in ways he could no longer explain away with logic or reason. The transition from silence to chaos was not a gradual one. It happened in the span of a heartbeat, a sound so violent and sharp that it seemed to vibrate within the inspector's very teeth. It was the sound of glass screaming. In the parlor, the large, hand-blown window pane did not merely crack, it disintegrated. The inspector rushed into the room, his boots crunching on thousands of tiny, diamond-like fragments that covered the floor. He stopped at the edge of the rug, his breath hitching in his throat as he observed the most unsettling detail of the destruction. The glass had not been blown out by an explosion, nor had it been struck by a stone from the garden. The shards lay thickest in the center of the room, having fallen inward with a terrifying velocity. He knelt down, his knees protesting the cold floor, and carefully examined the frame. The putty was undisturbed on the outside, and the delicate lace curtains, which should have been shredded by an external force, were draped neatly over the pile of broken crystal, as if they had been lifted and then dropped back into place by a gentle hand. There was no rock, no lead pellet, no tangible object to be found among the ruins. He spent the next hour meticulously searching the garden, the dew soaking through his trousers as he combed the grass beneath the window. He looked for any sign of a slingshot, a hidden mechanism, or even a stray pebble that might have been the culprit, but the earth was pristine, marked only by the light frost of a Mulhausen morning. When he returned inside, the atmosphere of the house had shifted. It felt denser, as if the air itself was resisting his movements. The family remained huddled in the kitchen, their faces pale and their eyes fixed on the floor, listening to the house groan. The inspector tried to offer words of comfort, but they felt hollow in the face of such impossible physics. He began to document the shattered glass, writing out the words 1867 at the top of a new page, his hand trembling slightly. He described the way the light caught the shards, turning the floor into a sea of glittering danger. It was as if the house was shedding its skin, piece by jagged piece, leaving the inhabitants exposed to a cold that no hearth fire could ever truly warm. Before he could finish his first paragraph, a dull, reverberating thud echoed from the floor above. It was a heavy, rhythmic sound, like the heartbeat of a giant. The inspector bolted for the stairs, his heart hammering against his ribs. The sound had come from the master bedroom, a room that he himself had locked and bolted not 20 minutes prior. He reached the landing, his lungs burning, and fumbled with the heavy iron key. The lock turned with a stubborn click, and he threw the door open, expecting to find an intruder. Instead, he was met with a scene of absolute, silent devastation. The room was empty of life, yet everything within it had been rearranged with a brutal strength. The massive oak wardrobe, a piece of furniture that had required 4 grown men to haul up the stairs during the family's move, was lying face down in the center of the room. It had been overturned with such force that the floorboards beneath it had splintered. The clothes inside were not scattered, but remained neatly folded, as if the wardrobe had simply decided to lie down and rest. The inspector stood in the doorway, the key still clutched in his white-knuckled hand. He looked at the window of the bedroom. It was closed and latched from the inside. He looked at the secondary door leading to the dressing room. It was bolted. There was no way for a human being to have entered, overturned a 300-pound cabinet, and vanished without leaving a trace. He walked over to the fallen giant of oak and pressed his hand against the wood. It was vibrating, not with the sound of the house, but with a low, thrumming energy that felt like a hive of bees trapped within the timber. He tried to lift the corner of the wardrobe, straining until the muscles in his back burned, but it would not budge an inch. It was as if it had become a permanent part of the floor, anchored by a gravity that only the house understood. The air in the room was freezing, several degrees colder than the hallway, and as he stood there, he watched as his own breath formed a thick, gray cloud in front of his face, swirling in the draftless air. He retreated from the room, locking it once more, though he knew now that locks were merely an illusion of safety. He returned to his notebook at the kitchen table, the blankness of the pages now mocking him. He began to write, his pen flying across the paper as he described the inward fall of the glass and the impossible movement of the oak. He wrote of the silence that followed the crashes, a silence that felt heavy and expectant. The house at Mulhausen was no longer just a structure of brick and mortar. It had become a living, breathing entity with a volatile temper. The violence was escalating, moving from small, annoying disturbances to acts of structural defiance. He looked at the family, who sat like statues in the dim light, and he realized that they were not just afraid of the ghost, but of the very walls that surrounded them. The shadows in the corners seemed to lengthen, stretching toward the center of the room as the sun climbed higher in the sky. And for the first time in his career, the inspector felt the cold, sharp edge of true, unadulterated dread. The glass was gone, the furniture was moved, and the night was still many hours away. The morning light in 1922 did not bring renewal to the house in Mulhausen. Instead, it revealed a world now irrevocably public. The secrets of tapping walls and shattering plates were property of the street. Fear travels strangely. It needs no open door. It seeps through mortar like a low fog. By the time the milkman finished his rounds on Tuesday, wheels echoing on the stones, whispers had taken root. People spoke in hushed tones at the bakery, eyes darting toward the residence that had become the protagonist of a ghost story. Locking the door the previous night was a gesture of desperation, but as the sun rose, it was clear no bolt could keep out the collective gaze of a town hungry for the inexplicable. Mulhausen was a border town, finding its footing 4 years after the Great War. The streets were a tapestry of French and German influences, adding a sharp edge to the tension. To some, the disturbances were a poltergeist, a noisy spirit from folklore. To others, it was a phenomenon to be studied with rationalism or feared as a lingering shadow of conflict. The cobblestones, damp with dew and the smell of the river, seemed to vibrate with the friction of two worlds. Every time a stone struck the interior walls, the vibration traveled through the foundation into the feet of those on the sidewalk. Even the distant bells of the cathedral seemed to toll with a new, somber weight that echoed through the narrow alleys. By mid-afternoon, the quiet lane was a theater. Onlookers gathered in clusters, blocking narrow passages with their carts. They were not there to help, but to witness. A cold gravity pulls people towards suffering that defies logic. They stood with coat collars turned up against the wind, breath misting in the air, staring at upper windows as if expecting a face that was not human. The air was thick with coal smoke and the metallic tang of factories, but beneath it all was anticipation. Every time a curtain twitched, a collective shiver ran through the crowd. They were waiting for the house to perform, turning a private tragedy into a public spectacle for the bored and the frightened who lined the sidewalks in silent vigil. The tension was about the invasion of the ordinary. Neighbors who had lived side by side for decades looked at one another with suspicion. If stones could manifest inside a locked room, why not in the kitchen next door? This uncertainty bred a quiet, simmering hostility. Local shopkeepers complained about the crowds, yet lingered in doorways for news, hands trembling as they polished counters. Was it true the teenage daughter was the source? Did furniture walk across the floor? Questions were asked in French and German, languages clashing in the chilly air. It was a town caught in a fever dream, where the line between miracle and curse was thin as paper and easily torn by the weight of a single unexplainable sound. Inside, the family felt the weight of hundreds of eyes. Windows, once portals, were now mirrors of morbid curiosity. They heard the low murmur of the crowd, a sound like a disturbed hive that never truly slept. It was a constant reminder they were no longer alone in their terror. The man who sought safety in a simple lock realized the true danger was the loss of his sanctuary. The house was no longer a home. It was a specimen under a microscope, cold and unforgiving. Every sound from within was amplified by the eerie silence of those waiting outside. The atmosphere was a suffocating pressure, as if the walls were being squeezed by the town. The floorboards felt colder, the shadows longer, and the silence deeper than ever before. As evening approached, the first professional investigators arrived. They moved through the crowd with a purpose that the locals found both comforting and terrifying. Carrying leather-bound notebooks and brass instruments, they represented the arrival of the outside world. Their presence only heightened the drama. The onlookers parted for them like water, watching as experts prepared to enter the threshold. Whispers reached a new crescendo, a frantic rustling as the town prepared for what was next. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the street. For a moment, the neighborhood held its breath. The stage was set, and the darkness was once again beginning to stir within the house in Mulhausen, ready to reveal its next secret to the waiting world in the dead of night. The heavy, black cases were unlatched with a collective, metallic snap that echoed through the narrow hallway of the Mulhausen home. For days, the house had been a theater of chaos, filled with the panicked whispers of neighbors and the frantic prayers of the family. But now, a different kind of presence had arrived. These men, draped in heavy wool coats and carrying the scent of ozone and laboratory dust, did not look for demons. They looked for data. They moved with a clinical, synchronized precision, clearing the heavy oak dining table to make room for their glass and steel instruments. The flickering candlelight, which had previously been the only defense against the dark, was replaced by the cold, steady glow of vacuum tubes. It was the arrival of the scientific lens, an attempt to trap the impossible within the rigid lines of a graph. They were the parapsychologists, and they brought with them the weight of empirical expectation. At the center of their arsenal were the magnetic tape recorders, those iconic Uher units that seemed to anchor the room with their physical heft. I want you to imagine the sound of those machines, a low, rhythmic whirring as the twin reels began their slow, clockwise dance. The brown, oxide-coated ribbons of tape slithered across the recording heads, a continuous loop of waiting. The investigators spent hours calibrating the sensitivity, adjusting the silver dials until the needles on the decibel meters rested at a perfect 0. These tapes were meant to catch the whispers that the human ear might dismiss as wind or wood grains settling. Every pop, every unexplained thud, and every rhythmic knocking that had plagued the family would now be etched onto a physical medium. There was a strange comfort in the mechanical reliability of the reels, a sense that if the phenomena could be recorded, it could finally be understood and perhaps controlled. While the audio team worked in the shadows, others focused on the very temperature of the air. They deployed thermal sensors, primitive but sensitive probes that were taped to the door frames and the corners of the ceiling. In the 1970s, this was the cutting edge of frontier science. These sensors were connected to long, trailing wires that snaked across the floorboards like copper vines, leading back to a central monitoring station. The investigators were hunting for the legendary cold spots, those localized plunges in temperature that often preceded a violent outburst of activity. They watched the thermal needles with unblinking intensity. If a heavy wardrobe were to slide across the floor without a hand to guide it, they wanted to know if the room itself had shivered first. The air in the house felt thick, charged with a static tension that made the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Yet the machines remained stubbornly, frustratingly silent for the first several hours of the vigil. In the corner of the parlor, a physicist from a prestigious institute sat hunched over an oscillograph. This machine was designed to measure the invisible pulses of the home's electrical grid. In the Mulhausen case, much like the famous disturbances in the town of Rosenheim, the electricity itself seemed to be a secondary victim of the haunting. Light bulbs had been known to unscrew themselves from their sockets, and fuses would blow with the force of a small explosion. The oscillograph's tiny, inked stylus scratched rhythmically against a moving roll of paper, creating a steady, horizontal line that represented the heartbeat of the house. The investigators were looking for surges, for spikes in power that had no earthly origin. They had even brought in a laboratory on wheels, a specialized van parked just outside the gate, filled with even more delicate monitoring equipment to ensure that no external radio frequency or seismic tremor could be mistaken for the paranormal. As the night deepened, the house became a labyrinth of wires and waiting. The investigators spoke in low, hushed tones, their footsteps muffled by the heavy rugs. They were not just monitoring the house, they were monitoring the people within it. They kept a close eye on the young girl who seemed to be the focal point of the energy, recording her every movement and emotional state with the same detachment they applied to the machines. They believed in the theory of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, the idea that deep, internal stress could manifest as physical force. The air grew colder, and the silence became heavy, broken only by the occasional click of a camera shutter or the soft scrape of a pen against a clipboard. It was a strange juxtaposition. The ancient, creaking architecture of the German countryside filled with the humming, glowing hardware of modern parapsychology. They were waiting for a bridge to form between the seen and the unseen. Suddenly, a sharp deflection appeared on the oscillograph. The needle began to jump, scratching a frantic, jagged mountain range onto the paper. At the same moment, the magnetic tape in the kitchen began to spin faster, as if caught in a sudden draft. One of the investigators signaled for silence, his hand raised, his eyes fixed on the thermal sensor readings which were beginning to plummet in the center of the hallway. There was no wind, no open window, and yet the air felt as though it were being drained of its warmth. The team held their breath, their fingers hovering over the buttons of their high-speed cameras. This was the moment they had traveled across the country to capture, the precise second where science meets the shadow. In the dim light, the dust motes seemed to freeze in midair, and the rhythmic whirring of the tape recorders became the only heartbeat left in the room, documenting a phenomenon that defied every law of physics they had ever studied. The data they collected that night would later be analyzed in quiet laboratories in Freiburg, scrutinized by skeptics and believers alike. They would look at the ink stains and the magnetic patterns, searching for a signature of the soul or a glitch in the universe. But in that moment, in the cold heart of the Mulhausen home, the technology felt fragile. The silver dials and glass tubes were merely observers to a power that did not care for calibration. As the investigators packed their cases in the early hours of the morning, they left behind a house that was still haunted, but now it was a house that had been measured. The scientific lens had been applied, and while it had captured the ripples on the surface of the water, the depths remained as dark and as silent as ever. We are left to wonder if some things are meant to be felt, rather than filmed, and if the true nature of the poltergeist lies just beyond the reach of the machine. The data they collected that night would later be analyzed in quiet laboratories in Freiburg, scrutinized by skeptics and believers alike. They would look at the way the needles on the equipment jumped, the way the temperature plummeted, and the curious, rhythmic timing of the disturbances. But to understand the true heart of what happened in Mulhausen, we must step away from the cold precision of the instruments and back into the thick, suffocating air of the Berner household. It was a home where the very foundations seemed to groan under the weight of an unseen visitor, a place where the ordinary laws of physics had simply ceased to apply. In the small village of Ilfurt, just 5 miles from the center of Mulhausen, a storm was brewing, but it was not one of wind and rain. This was a storm of the spirit, a vortex of energy that found its way into the lives of 2 young boys, Thibaut and Joseph. They were brothers, only 9 and 7 years old, yet they had become the lightning rods for a power that neither they nor their parents could hope to contain. Imagine the scene in 1869. The house is a modest one, filled with the scents of wood smoke and old stone. But as the sun dips below the horizon, a low vibration begins to hum through the floorboards. It starts as a subtle tremor, like a heavy carriage passing on a distant road, but it rapidly grows into something much more visceral. The beds where the boys sleep begin to shudder. At first, it is a gentle rocking, almost like a cradle, but within minutes, the wooden frames are bucking and leaping against the walls. The sound is deafening, a cacophony of wood striking wood that echoes through the quiet village streets. Neighbors would stand outside, whispering and crossing themselves, watching as the windows rattled with a fury that no storm could replicate. Inside, the family lived in a state of constant, exhausting vigilance, their eyes fixed on the children who seemed to be both the victims and the source of this terrifying display. In the study of parapsychology, researchers often speak of the focal person. This is the individual, frequently a child or an adolescent, who acts as the unwitting epicenter of poltergeist activity. In the case of Mulhausen, the energy did not merely haunt the house. It clung to Thibaut and Joseph like a second skin. When they walked through a room, the furniture would tilt and slide toward them, as if drawn by a powerful magnetic force. Heavy wardrobes, which would have required several grown men to move, were seen to glide across the floor with the grace of a dancer. It was as if the boys were walking through a dream where the world was made of shadows and smoke, rather than solid matter. Investigators noted that the phenomena were most intense when the boys were in a state of emotional turmoil or deep fatigue. It was a realization that would later form the basis of the theory that poltergeists are not external spirits, but a form of spontaneous psychokinesis, a release of repressed psychic energy that manifests in the physical world. But the storm was not limited to the movement of objects. There was a deeper, more unsettling layer to the events in the burner home. The boys, who had only ever known the local dialect, began to speak in voices that were not their own. They would converse fluently in Latin, English, and other languages they had never been taught. Their voices would drop into a low, gravelly register, the words flowing with a chilling precision. They would speak of things happening miles away, describing the movements of strangers or the contents of sealed envelopes with a terrifying accuracy. It was this clairvoyance, this breaking of the boundaries of the self, that truly unnerved those who witnessed it. The priests and the doctors who gathered in the small room felt a coldness that had nothing to do with the winter air. They were witnessing the dissolution of the barrier between the mind and the world, a moment where the internal became external in the most violent and unpredictable of ways. The family was trapped in the center of this storm for years. The parents, Joseph and Anna Maria, were respected and industrious people, yet they found themselves at the mercy of a phenomenon that stripped away their dignity and their peace. They watched as their children were lifted from their beds by invisible hands, suspended in the air for moments that felt like an eternity. They watched as the very air around the boys seemed to thicken and shimmer with a strange, unnatural heat. The village of Ilfurt became a site of pilgrimage and fear, as people came from all over to witness the children of the storm. It was a period of intense public scrutiny, an ordeal that left the family physically and emotionally shattered. Yet, despite the thousands of eyes upon them, no evidence of trickery was ever found. The events were too consistent, too powerful, and too deeply rooted in the presence of the two boys to be explained away as simple deception. As the boys grew older, the storm began to recede, much like a tide pulling away from the shore. The violence of the manifestations faded into occasional taps and whispers, before finally vanishing altogether. But the memory of those years remained etched into the stones of the house and the minds of those who lived through it. When the researchers in Freiburg looked back at the records of Mulhausen, they didn't just see a ghost story. They saw a profound mystery of the human psyche, a glimpse into a potential that lies dormant within us all. They saw the way that a focal person can bend the world around them, turning a quiet home into a theater of the impossible. The story of Thibaut and Joseph Berner is a reminder that the most powerful storms are often the ones that start from within, swirling in the hidden depths of the mind, until they find a way to break through into the light. The sun began to dip below the horizon of the small village, casting long, bruised shadows across the stone floor of the family home. It was the autumn of 1869, a season that should have brought the peaceful harvest, but for those inside the walls of the Berner residence, the coming of night was always met with a hollow, chest-deep dread. For months, the two boys, Joseph and Theobald, had been the center of a storm that defied every law of nature. Yet, on this specific evening, there was a stillness that felt different, a heavy, electric charge in the air that made the fine hairs on one's arms stand at attention. The previous weeks had seen a slight softening of the manifestations, leading the family to hope that the ordeal was finally coming to a close. They did not yet know that they were merely in the eye of a much larger, much darker storm. This was to be the night of chaos, a 6-hour descent into a reality that none of them would ever be able to fully forget. The air in the kitchen was thick with the scent of damp wool and cooling tallow, and the only sound was the rhythmic, soft ticking of a clock that seemed to be counting down to something inevitable. As the clock struck 10 in the evening, the first sign appeared. It was not a scream or a crash, but a subtle, rhythmic scratching that seemed to originate from inside the thick oak beams of the ceiling. The family sat together in the dim light of a single lantern, their eyes fixed on the shadows. Gradually, the scratching evolved into a series of sharp, rhythmic raps that echoed through the house like the heartbeat of a giant. Theobald, the younger of the two boys, began to tremble, his eyes widening as he looked toward the heavy wardrobe in the corner of the room. This piece of furniture, crafted from solid wood and filled with linens, weighed nearly 300 pounds. Without a hand touching it, the wardrobe began to tilt forward on its base, pausing at an impossible angle before slamming back against the wall with a force that shook the very foundations of the cottage. This was the opening note of a symphony of disorder that would not find its resolution for many hours to come. By 11 o'clock, the atmosphere in the house had shifted entirely. The temperature dropped so sharply that the breath of the witnesses began to fog in the air, creating a ghostly mist that swirled around the furniture. Then the auditory landscape transformed. It no longer sounded like simple knocking. It sounded as though 1,000 hammers were striking the outer walls from every direction at once. The parents tried to gather the boys, but the invisible force was relentless. Joseph was suddenly lifted from his seat, his small frame hovering several inches above the floor as if suspended by silken threads. He remained there, eyes closed, whispering in a language that no one in the village of Mulhausen could recognize. The sound of his voice was low and guttural, a stark contrast to his usual youthful tone. Outside, neighbors began to gather in the dark garden, drawn by the cacophony. They reported hearing the sounds of heavy chains being dragged across the roof and the peculiar, sickening sound of glass shattering, though when they looked, every window remained perfectly intact. The clock crawled toward midnight, and the chaos reached a new level of physical intensity. Objects began to take flight across the room with a terrifying precision. Pewter plates slid from the shelves, circling the air in wide, lazy arcs before pinning themselves against the opposing wall. The smell of ozone and sulfur filled the house, a pungent, biting aroma that made it difficult to draw a full breath. Theobald's bed, which had been pushed against the wall for safety, began to buck like a frightened horse. It rose nearly 2 feet into the air, spinning slowly on its axis while the boy clung to the mattress, his knuckles white with the effort. Every attempt by the father to hold the bed down resulted in him being pushed back by an invisible, cold pressure that felt like a wall of moving water. There was no logic to the movement, no pattern that they could discern, only a relentless, exhausting tide of motion that seemed designed to drain the will of everyone present. Between the hours of 1 and 3 in the morning, the house felt as though it had been detached from the world of the living. The very air seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum that vibrated in the teeth and bones of the family. The manifestations had become so dense that it was dangerous to move. A heavy kitchen table was flipped onto its side, and the chairs began to stack themselves in a perfect, impossible tower reaching toward the rafters. Whenever the family tried to pray, the noises would double in volume, drowning out their voices with a sound like roaring wind. Joseph and Theobald were now in a state of deep trance, their bodies rigid. They were moved about the room like chess pieces, shifted from corner to corner by the unseen presence. Despite the violence of the movements, the boys remained physically unharmed, though the psychic toll was etched into their pale, sweating faces. The parents could only watch in a state of paralyzed exhaustion, their strength completely spent as they witnessed the total surrender of their home to the unknown. As the 4th hour of the morning approached, the peak of the storm finally began to break. The frantic energy that had fueled the furniture's flight and the walls shaking started to bleed away. The wardrobe, which had spent much of the night vibrating across the floor, came to a final, heavy rest. The plates that had been pinned to the walls fell to the floor in unison, clattering but remarkably remaining unbroken. The suffocating smell of sulfur dissipated, replaced by the cool, damp air of the pre-dawn woods. The 6 hours of constant, unrelenting activity had left the interior of the house in a state of utter disarray. Yet as the first gray light of morning touched the window panes, a profound silence returned. The boys slumped into a deep, natural sleep, their breathing finally evening out. The witnesses outside dispersed, whispering of what they had heard, leaving the family to sit in the wreckage of their normalcy. They had survived the night of chaos, but the memory of those 6 hours would remain as a cold weight in their hearts, a reminder that the world they knew was far thinner and more fragile than they had ever dared to imagine. The air in the small house in Ilfrith grew thick with a sudden, heavy stillness. As the 4th hour of the morning finally gave way to a bruised and misty dawn, the frantic energy that had possessed the very walls seemed to evaporate like wood smoke. For years, the Burner family had lived in a state of constant terror, their home a theater for things that defied every law of nature. But now, as the golden light of 1869 began to touch the window panes, the silence was no longer a taut, waiting thing. It was a soft blanket. The heavy oak wardrobes that had danced and groaned against the floorboards sat motionless, their dark wood reflecting the flickering embers of the hearth. There were no more scratches behind the plaster, no more whispers in foreign languages that the young boys could not possibly have understood. The storm had passed, leaving behind a house that felt hollow, yet finally, mercifully, empty of its shadow. In the following days, the village of Ilfrith watched with held breath as the Burner household began the long, quiet process of reclaiming its sanity. The parents, whose faces had been carved with the deep lines of exhaustion for 4 long years, moved through the rooms with a ghostly, tentative grace. They touched the furniture as if expecting it to move on its own, their fingers tracing the deep gouges left by unseen forces. The strange, cloying scent of sulfur and wet seaweed, which had once permeated every curtain and rug, began to yield to the simple, honest smells of baking bread and fresh laundry. It was as if the house itself were taking a long, deep breath, exhaling the residue of the darkness that had nested there. The brothers, Theobald and Joseph, slept for hours that stretched into days, their bodies finally released from the agonizing contortions that had once twisted their young limbs into impossible knots. Their breathing was even, a gentle tide that signaled a peace they had almost forgotten existed. But the cessation of the haunting was not merely a quiet end. It was the beginning of a bittersweet legacy. While the physical manifestations had vanished, the toll they had taken on the young brothers was etched deep into their very souls. The records of the time tell us that the boys were never quite the same, their eyes often drifting to corners of the room where the shadows seemed to linger just a second too long. Theobald, the elder of the two, found his strength failing him only 2 years after the final rituals were completed. In the spring of 1871, at the tender age of 16, his spirit slipped away quietly, as if he had simply used up a lifetime of energy in those 4 years of struggle. Joseph lived longer, surviving until 1882, but he carried the memory of those days like a hidden weight. He reached the age of 25 before he too joined his brother, leaving behind a community that would tell their story for over a century. Today, the quiet town near Mulhausen holds the memory of the Burner brothers in a way that is both solemn and haunting. If you were to walk through the narrow streets of Ilfrith, you might find your way to the tall, elegant column topped with a statue of the Virgin Mary. It stands as a silent sentinel, a monument to the events that concluded in 1869. It was erected as a gesture of gratitude for the deliverance of the boys, a physical anchor for a story that sounds like a fever dream to the modern ear. The parish records of St. Stephen still contain the detailed accounts of the yellow froth, the inexplicable feathers that once filled the air, and the clairvoyant predictions that chilled the hearts of the townspeople. These yellowed documents are the fading echoes of a reality that existed on the periphery of our understanding, a reminder that some shadows are too deep to be fully explained by the light of reason. As we look back on the Mulhausen Poltergeist, we are left to wonder about the nature of the energy that briefly tore through that small family. Was it truly a visitation from another realm, or was it the manifestation of some hidden, internal pressure that found its way into the physical world? The scholars and the skeptics have debated the case for decades, dissecting every account of levitation and every word spoken in Latin or English. Yet the answer remains just out of reach, buried under the weight of time and the shifting nature of human belief. What remains is the image of a house that finally found its peace, and a family that could finally close their eyes without the fear of what the night might bring. The echoes have faded, the furniture is still, and the feathers have long since turned to dust. The story of the Burner brothers belongs now to the silence of history, a soft whisper in the dark for those who choose to listen. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.